Okay, Eve, we're live. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Reyes-Aguirre, and I am running for U.S. Senate here in the state of Arizona. I've been an organizer around Indigenous rights and women's rights and human rights for about 20 years here in the state of Arizona, and it's time, I think, for us to have some effective change in government and in the political system.
Great. And then I noticed that you're a representative for your tribe at the United Nations. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So I've been participating at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for about 9 years now. And the first time attending was really a process of learning how to participate and bring forward issues around Indigenous people, specifically my people, at the United Nations level. So this is an international body. People show up to express issues there when they felt that the domestic process has been exhausted. Many Indigenous peoples from all over the world show up there to represent their nations and move forward on issues that they feel their governments are not addressing.
And the Indigenous people were not always invited to the United Nations. Can you tell us when that started and how that came about?
Absolutely. So in the 1970s, a group of Indigenous leaders attended the United Nations to participate as a nation-to-nation entity, and they were denied access and they were denied entry. Since then, they fought really hard to bring forward a voice for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations specifically into this arena as a sovereign nations within the U.S. governmental system. They felt that it was important for them to bring their issues to international level to resolve disputes from a nation-to-nation point of view. So when you're in a domestic arena fighting against a government that is not respecting your rights as a sovereign nation, you have to find a way to resolve that. And the way to do that was through the international arena.
And so that's great. You have been representing us there for what you say, 9 years?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I saw an article that I'm not sure if you were quoted as or you wrote it. It was on it was part of the I'm sorry, the Me Too movement with women in Indigenous women, and they're not being reported missing and sexual assault and problems with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is really important and that I learned working in the international arena is that bringing forward the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, specifically here in the US, it's the issue that's not being discussed. These women are being assaulted and what's termed as disappeared in the international arena, many murdered, and there's no investigation, there's no justice being brought forward. I think just in the recent years, is it becoming known that this is even an issue? So what I learned about this in the work that I've taken that issue to the United Nations is that this is not just an issue that happens amongst Indigenous women here in the US. It's actually a global epidemic. It's Indigenous women globally who are experiencing violence, murder, they're being disappeared. So one of the things that I think is important is to highlight that it's not just an issue here in the US, it is a global issue, and these women, Indigenous women, are being marginalized in regards to getting justice for that issue. I think it's really important to talk about that had this been a non-Indigenous woman's issue, if this was, let's say, a white woman's issue, for example, it would be a national issue. We'd be talking about it. It'd be all over the mainstream media, and people would be demanding justice. The fact that this has been going on for decades and that there is no attention around it, I feel it's really important for us to have that conversation. And the Me Too movement kind of opened that door for people to start realizing and for that this is an issue. And it kind of allowed us to open up that door to the awareness around it. So now people are becoming more aware of what's going on.
And do you think American media is culpable in this ignoring assaults and murders and missing Indigenous women?
I think that they have a part in it. I think it's really important that us in our homes are watching what they're putting on the television, and what they want to focus on are issues that are not affecting people on a community level. I think if they had a better idea of how these issues affect people personally in their communities, it might be something that's more important. I feel like we've kind of become numb to what's going on in our system and society. I think, for example, the school shootings that have happened recently, you don't see anything on mainstream media, very little about it. And these are our children. Our children are dying going to school, and it's not becoming an issue. Instead, mainstream media wants to focus on what this administration is saying in their Twitter feed and the despicable remarks that are being made. And that's just unacceptable for our children. It's unacceptable that this is what is being fed to them instead of real concrete issues and solutions. That's what we should be discussing on the news, not what somebody said about somebody else on Twitter.
Absolutely. This actually brings up an incident I remember during the Iraq War, or maybe it was Afghanistan, when Jessica Lynch and Shoshana Johnson were taken captive in an ambush. What media also didn't tell us was that during that same ambush, Lori Pestois was an Indigenous woman who was killed. Jessica Lynch and Shoshana Johnson got all the media, and an Indigenous woman got ignored.
This is correct. And this is where I think we need, and me personally stepping into this arena of politics, my focus is to bring forward issues that are not being addressed by marginalized communities. I've been an Indigenous activist for 20 years, but now these issues that we've been fighting are not only Indigenous issues anymore. I've seen people talk about, well, you know, she has experience in Indigenous issues, but what about the rest of us? Well, as long as you're drinking water and you're eating from the same food systems as we are, it is an issue for everybody, for humanity. Indigenous peoples are affected first by a lot of policies, but they are not only affecting Indigenous peoples. We are at a time where these issues are affecting everybody. And I think Flint, Michigan is a good example of that. The people of Standing Rock were fighting for their protection of their water so that what happened to the people of Flint in regards to contamination of their drinking water wouldn't happen to their people.
Yes, absolutely. And they're a sovereign nation. So
absolutely.
Okay, so women are kind of underrepresented in our elected officials, and I think even in the Green Party to a large part, even though we have Jill Stein. Can you talk about women's representation in our government?
Absolutely. I think it's important for us as women to step up and start taking on leadership roles. A really good advisor of mine said, imagine what government would be like if 50% of the government leaders who are making decisions were women. And you really have to think about that. As a mother, as a soon-to-be grandmother, I think about the decisions that I make and how they're going to affect my children. I guarantee you women will think twice when it comes to having to put our children in the military on the front lines to fight a war needlessly, when those types of issues can be addressed in a nonviolent way. So I really feel like women need to step up, and we also need to advocate for ourselves, for our bodies, for our rights. The fact that we have a majority of men making decisions on behalf of women and how they need to make choices for themselves and their families, it's just unacceptable. It needs to change.
Yes, I think we certainly need, well, we definitely need to break the final glass ceiling, but we need more women representing us in office. So you're running it in Arizona, where Sheriff Arpaio, ex-Sheriff Arpaio, is also running for a Senate seat. Can you tell us a little bit about Arpaio and I don't know, the bigotry that comes with our current president and Arpaio in correlation with each other, I guess.
Yeah, so I personally, along with many community members, stood on the front lines in the fight to get Joe Arpaio out of office. The organization I worked for was one of the plaintiffs on the lawsuits against SB 1070, specifically around the discriminatory police practices that Arpaio illegally were enforcing. And so he is no stranger to me. He and I have been on the battlefield for quite some time here in Arizona. What's very concerning is that somebody who does not follow the law, who was found by a judge guilty of violating law, wants to now go into the US Senate to make laws when he himself does not follow law. So Joe Arpaio here, I think the community spoke when we pushed him out of office. We didn't want his racism, his disregard for women, the treatment of his prisoners, the human rights violations that he was on a daily basis inflicting upon people in Tent City. These kinds of things are just unacceptable. And I can only imagine what kind of changes and policies he would put forward that would affect us nationally if this is what he was doing just in our community as a sheriff in Maricopa County.
Right. And so you have been on the front line of social justice issues for basically your entire career. Can you tell us what you have advocated for in some of your activism?
Absolutely. So a lot of the issues that we've fought for on the ground are around Indigenous peoples, and more specifically around resources and territorial issues. A lot of our people are being affected by extractive industries, mining companies that are coming in, similar to Standing Rock, wanting to desecrate the land, contaminate the water. And so we've been on the front line of that fight for a long time. The Navajo Nation here specifically has been fighting against mining in their territory for many years. And the cancer rate amongst Navajo people in the last 40 years has risen astronomically because of uranium mining, because of the dust that has been exposed into the air. And this is a huge issue. The women specifically are being affected via their reproductive organs, the birthing of their children. Their children are being affected through these kinds of contaminations and extractive companies. There is no justice being brought to these people for what's being done to their land and how this dust has been contaminating the air. The thing that people need to understand and recognize now is that the air is something that all of us breathe. That dust does not discriminate, and it's not only going to affect the people that are living in that rural area. The other thing to note is that the watershed, which is the Colorado Rivershed, that water that is being threatened by mining companies here in the state of Arizona is going to affect the people of Arizona. We depend on that water. It may affect the Havasupai tribe first because their water aquifers are closest, but that water, those contaminants will come down and reach the people of Arizona and in the cities. And it's just as important to address that now with this administration rolling back a lot of regulations, including opening up federal lands to these extractive industries.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's where they miss the idea that it's going to affect everybody in in the whole country. These environmental issues. So, what other environmental issues are you an advocate for? You talked about Standing Rock, and you talked about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. It sounds like you guys are also water protectors to some degree, based on what you just said. Or let me ask you a different way. What would you do to for the environment in your position as a U.S. Senator?
I think the first thing we have to do is definitely regulate how these companies are operating and limit the damage they're doing. The other thing we need to do is we need to look at other options. We need to look at more sustainable options. The fact that extractive industries are now looking for new ways to explore and extract these resources from our earth via, fracking is a good example. The fact that they have to find different methods to remove these gases and other minerals and resources from the earth is telling you that we're at the bottom of the barrel. There's nothing left, and we need to start looking at other options. This is not a sustainable way for our future. And so the fact that it does so much damage to our water systems, our food systems, it affects the people living in those areas. And like I said, it's not just limited to Indigenous peoples anymore. We've seen, small family farmers, that are being affected. Their lands are being taken because they want to put pipelines coming through this. I think the other important thing that I'd like to address is, where is this oil going? Where is this uranium that they're mining going? Uranium is used to make nuclear weapons. We need to start asking these important questions and holding our government responsible for this. They have to be accountable to answering questions about where this is going and how is this benefiting the people here.
Yeah. So the Green Party has the Green New Deal, which is to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies. And it seems to me like this is their last push to get all the fossil fuels out of the ground before we actually make that conversion, because I think it's inevitable.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about Arpaio and how he's, some of his bigotry, I should say. But one thing is he profiles Hispanics quite a bit and is very against immigration, as well as Trump, our current administration. Can you talk about your views on immigration? Because Arizona is obviously a border state, and it's a big issue there.
Absolutely. So I think what's important to note is people want to use these families who are migrating north as scapegoats. We're not asking the important questions. What's causing the migration? Why is it? What are these families fleeing from? Most of the time, the answers are violence or economic reasons. So this goes back into U.S. policy and law. How are U.S. policies affecting the migration patterns that are happening, with our neighboring countries? when we look at our trade agreements, the North American Free Trade Agreement is a perfect example. The poverty rate has risen in Mexico because of the North American Free Trade Agreement. These people are now out of jobs, looking for work, trying to support their families. This is why migration is happening. This is just one of the reasons. Another reason has a lot to do with our policy in supporting militarization of other countries. I think that's really important that nobody's talking about. We had an influx of young people fleeing violence in the countries in the South. Who's providing these countries, these government leaders with arms? Via the Merida Initiative, the US gives money to these governments in the South, specifically in Mexico, and these governments are using those arms to militarize their police and inflict violence. And so I think we need to start looking at not just using these families as scapegoats, and because they are innocent victims of decisions that US and other country leaders are making. They are victims of policies and greed and corruption that these policies are allowing. It's evident that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class are one paycheck away from becoming poor. And so we have to really start asking those questions and holding these governments accountable to who those free trade agreements are benefiting. Are they benefiting the people of the countries, or are they only benefiting corporations? That's the important question I think we need to be asking when we're talking about immigration.
Yeah, I think a good way to frame that is we should have a good neighbor policy and try to bring our neighbors up with us, and think of them that way as neighbors.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how about you just we'll wrap up by you just telling us about your campaign. Are you gathering signatures right now? Where are you at on that?
Yeah, so I have about 550 signatures. I need close to about 1,100 to get on the ballot. So right now, our campaign team is focusing on getting our signatures. I am running as a Green Party candidate, which limits my signatures to anyone who's registered as Green or Independent. And our focus is on that. If we can get on the ballot, then I think we've accomplished goal number one. Then we can move on to moving forward in other ways. But right now, I'm asking people to follow us on social media. I think that is a critical tool for us who are not being called upon in the mainstream media. I think social media is a way for us to promote ourselves. But more importantly, I think it's time for us to start looking at the duopoly that exists in the US government system. This duopoly is clearly has corporate interests over people. And I think it's time for us to start looking for other options. In my opinion, the Green Party is the option. We're looking at the 10 key values of the Green Party. They are very much in line with what people are demanding for in regards to justice and renewable energies and a government system that's fair and equitable. I think people need to look at that and know that there are other choices out there.
Yeah, so it sounds like you can only get signatures from people registered Independent or Green?
That's correct. And they have to be registered to vote just in the state of Arizona.
Uh-huh. And do you have a feel for the breakdown? Are there a lot of independents? Here in California, we actually have a lot of NPP voters. Now, we don't have that stipulation that somebody has to be registered to your party, but in California, it would be very easy because I think near half or maybe even more than half are NPP voters. How does that break down in Arizona?
I believe the number I saw last was about 67% of Arizona voters are independent.
Oh,
They,
wow.
yeah, they choose to vote either in any party, but
Uh-huh.
nonetheless, they are independent. And I think right now, at least the trend that I'm starting to see on the ground is people are changing their political affiliation from one of the major parties to independent or green, and that's a huge shift. I think people who the young people are now starting to look at what our administration has become and what's being called the norm now, and they're saying this is just not what I want. This is not the future that that we need to have for us as young people. And them as future leaders are now starting to take on roles of engaging their peers to get involved and get registered to vote.
Excellent. That's great. That makes me optimistic. I think we're seeing that nationwide, that conversion away from the two-party. I believe it's a monopoly because I think they work in tandem.
I
Uh,
agree.
yeah. So if somebody wants to help you or donate to your campaign or help you get signatures, is there a website they can go to?
Yes, so my website is Eve for AZ. That's EVE, the number 4, AZ.com. On my website, you will find ways to volunteer, you will find ways to donate, you will find my petition, a link to the petition where you can sign that online, which is very, very wonderful. And we're going to be putting up a link for a calendar of events where we will be at different locations in the city. And you can also find my social media connections on the website as well. So I ask everybody to please follow me. I know I'm not getting mainstream media attention, and so the only way to really know me as a candidate is to come and meet me or through interviews like this. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Excellent. So I started this channel was to get the Green Party as much media as I possibly could. I know it's a small effort, but one more thing to tell you is that I'm actually a native of Arizona. I was born in Casa Grande.
Wonderful.
Yeah, right between Tucson and Phoenix. So,
We'll move back because we need your signature on our ballot.
oh, okay. You know what I'll do is I'll forward this to my family and see if they could help you out there. And that's why I made this video, or I make these videos, is to help our Green Party candidates get out there, get seen, and get on the ballot. So I thank you, Eve, for doing this interview and for being a good progressive candidate and running for the Green Party. I'm really optimistic
Thank
about
you.
your campaign,
Thank you
and
for
I wish you
having
luck.
me. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.